The purpose of this series is to disrupt some of the certainty that I observe people have around these topics in order to gain clarity. So, what we discover over and over is that sometimes we have to disrupt our thinking and introduce a little friction, challenge our perspectives, and kind of parse it out. And eventually, this leads us to more clarity. There's something here that I love reiterating because it was a huge insight in my personal development, which is around our commitment to certainty and how that feels good. And it allows us to be confident in our decisions, be confident in our judgments. But really, we lose clarity, nuance, context when we're overly certain. And so the prioritization in a lot of human decision intelligence is clarity over certainty. And not that certainty isn't important, it is. But clarity is more important many times, maybe I would even say often more so. So how do we get to clarity? How do we discover a more expansive contextual understanding? And that usually we have to let go of some of our certainty.
Yeah. Tonight, we're talking about substitution. I'm always interested in what humans are losing because of substitutions and therefore what we can regain.
A substitution is when we substitute a less than for a greater than. And it's one of the more powerful self-sabotaging human habits.
Why does substitution matter?
Substitution matters because the less conscious reason we're substituting is to meet a need or a desire. So, for example, our social habits around having fun, either in a need to feel better or a desire to have joy. There's a substitution there for something that is quick and easy. Let's go drink or let's go have a party. And by the way, these are good things. I'm not saying that going partying and having a drink are bad. I'm saying when that becomes the only way that one can feel like a need is being met or like a desire is being met. And the question here is to look at what is the need and what is the desire. And is it just to have a night of fun? Great. If it's a repetitive thing, and it's the only go-to that we have, wow, this reveals there's a disconnect from a deeper need for connection, joy, intimacy, belonging.
Yeah. And I think in the long term that substitutions do end up having negative costs. So maybe you're spending more money than you want to spend on going out. You're drinking more alcohol than you want to drink. You're getting less sleep than you need. And so those end up becoming the costs of substitutions over time.
A worse deficit emotionally, not just physically, as you say, and financially, but also, wow, you're getting further and further away from actually meeting that need of actual connection or a deeper experience of intimacy or a deeper experience of belonging because it's too surface. What's required to develop the things that we want and need most is usually time and attention and energy and a kind of labor that is more difficult. And so that is the point of this substitution conversation, is that what are we sacrificing? What are we shortcutting? And we're disconnected to the fact that we're actually not even getting what we want. And we're creating an additional deficit. Like you said, the cost is there. It's just more hidden and less traceable.
Yeah. And to be more disciplined in prioritizing what we truly want and need over what we substitute for in moments. So I'm going to hit you with some of the substitutions because I think that they'll flesh out different aspects of where this can go wrong. Caffeinated drinks for sleep. I mean, this is huge in our culture. That or like having a coffee when we feel tired instead of taking a nap.
100%. I mean, that's an excellent substitution. Like we substitute our health in so many ways, whether it's sleep or not, to stay up to speed, to stay engaged, to stay productive, right? All of these things. And then also how we substitute sex often for, and I'm super pro sex, super sex positive, but when there's a repetitive substitution of sex for intimacy, or sex for belonging, or sex for actual relationship, there's all kinds of substitutions around intimacy and belonging. Like this is pretty expansive in the human condition. And that's what we're actually pointing to. What can we notice that we're substituting less than for a greater than that usually requires a lot more effort and energy and labor?
So yeah, when we need an afternoon coffee because we didn't sleep all the night before, or we've got soccer games and ballet practices and we're going a million places and we need to roll through a drive-through, we understand those substitutions in moments are incredibly useful and necessary as humans. So what we're talking about is the over-reliance on them as long-term strategies that prevent us and bypass us from getting the real thing.
Yeah, and we can even list more, like in terms of dating apps are a quick substitution. Doesn't match the way that we develop connection and doesn't actually engage our instinct and intuition that happens when we're physically present. And also doesn't require the same risk, which actually has a negative effect because now we do not have the skills and capacity for relationship when we're overly habituating ourselves towards a frictionless encounter and also a frictionless decision because now we have the metrics that are gamified and that aren't actually comprehensive that we're making decisions with. Another one is this endless learning with podcasts and YouTube and reading books. There's this consumption, we're listening, we're absorbing, we're taking that information as the substitute for actual action or becoming, because that takes up all your time. There is no time to actually activate that or to have contemplation or to integrate and to assimilate that information in a way. And so this is a kind of parallel with something that I speak to all the time, which is we substitute meaning for being. In other words, I have all this knowledge and insight, and it makes me feel like I'm smart and I'm good and I have this understanding, and it makes me feel like I identify with this meaning, that I am this meaning. But in fact, it is not. It is not becoming. We don't actually integrate or metabolize or assimilate in a way that we're becoming what we believe. That requires time, requires contemplation, requires risk, requires relationship to actually activate those principles. So a lot of our culture is committed to meaning and knowledge instead of becoming. And that is one of the most powerfully destructive substitutions.
Another one of the things we talk about a lot that aligns with this topic is speed versus efficiency, where the substitution is quick, it's immediate, right? We talk about this culture of immediacy. It seems to solve the perception that we have of the problem. And what it does is it actually creates, in many cases, more problems.
We want frictionless, quick experiences that are comfortable and don't require us to be vulnerable. So it's like, what do we skip in our substitutions? We often skip vulnerability. We often skip the risk that it involves to be vulnerable or to have potential failure. We skip patience. We skip tolerance. We skip ambiguity so that we can feel that we're more secure or that we have self-worth and significance. So all of these substitutions are providing us something immediate, but then we're skipping the emotional and mental labor of becoming.
So, what we're saying here is that when we engage in using substitutions in a prolonged fashion, in a repetition, not as a temporary thing, but really as a long-term strategy, that we skip practicing the skills of becoming. And some of those skills that lead to becoming are things like being able to be patient and wait. Instead, we eject into this immediacy. I really like the vulnerability. And there's vulnerability, even back to your example about knowledge, the vulnerability of not knowing and sitting and not knowing to find out in a more contemplative way versus in a tips and tricks fashion, which shortcuts the vulnerability of not knowing. And also sitting in discomfort, like ejecting from any of these places where we don't like to wait, we don't like to be vulnerable, we don't like to be uncomfortable. And so it's inviting us to stay in these places a little bit longer to integrate what we can learn from those places and become someone who is then incorporating these skills into who we are instead of bypassing them and having symptomatic solutions that it costs us not just the skills of becoming, but also the deficits that we create by using substitutions.
Yeah, that is the key thing, is that there's a compounding cost and deficit that is greater than any immediate benefit when we're substituting. That is really important. And I think that people aren't mapping that and they're not actually attentive to those calculations, that it's very self-sabotaging and increasing our pain, not actually solving it, and certainly not to the degree that we assume.
I want to ask you about the frictionless, because you've used that word a couple of times, and I think that is a good way to think about how we're programmed. In what ways are we being programmed to continue that self-sabotage?
Yeah, I mean, another example of this is like the corporate values that go on a wall, right? That's a substitution for the actual lived culture. And if you think about it, like, that print or whatever is cheap, But behavior change is costly in one sense, and it also threatens the hierarchies of power. So there's a substitution there that I think is a little bit insidious in this example, because I think leaders understand this, right? Even if they don't want to acknowledge it fully. But this idea that we can substitute through a formed structure of values of what is required of us to live those values. And in so many ways, it sets the corporate structure culture up to be smoother, because again, it's like reducing the friction with the power hierarchy that is in place. What happens when we're really, really well adapted humans living into our values? Well, that usually typically threatens those in power. And this kind of pairs well with like the mindset only coaching cliches, right? That if it's only just our mindset, it removes the kind of grind of structural change, and it removes the need for acquiring new skills or developing new skills. And it sells really well in sound bites.
An example of that is like the power of your mind, just change your perspective and all the problems go away. Is that what you're
Yeah,
referring
I mean,
to?
just where everything is just
Yeah.
like, oh, well, change your mind or change your attitude, and mindset is important. But when it's the only thing, right? It's a substitution, because if we are saying we're interested in change, it has to involve structural change, and it has to involve skill, which is sure to some degree mindset shifting is a skill, but we need more
Mhm.
than just seeing another perspective. How do we activate ourselves inside that perspective? That requires us a different kind of skill than just seeing it. I think also another substitution that's kind of in the same veins in this area is when you have these cause brand consumerism. Right? People can buy a product and can feel really good about it in a way that kind of absolves them of, environmental problems. That really what needs to happen is we need to have some deeper activism and sustained civic engagement and shit. But instead we can feel good about, and I'm guilty of this myself, because there are people in the world who are really, devoted to this. Yes, I'm going to support them and do that. And that is great. We need to do that. But also in a way, it does emotionally absolve us to where we don't have to keep going, that's not the solution. That's just a part of the solution.
Oh, this angers me so much. It's like the picture of the turtle with the straw through its nose and like the move to paper straws, which I am not against paper straws, just to state that for the record. But the problem you're pointing to here is if we substitute using paper straws for fixing the real problem, that there are
Yeah.
tons of plastic that ends up in tons of oceans via a ton of rivers and other sources, then we somehow let ourselves off the hook when we use the paper straw and give ourselves a little pat on the back. And what this does, the cost of this, is that we aren't engaging in the ways that we need to make the root cause change.
Yeah. And one of the things that comes to mind in kind of identifying the substitutions is when the substitution offers a closure, a loop closure, like you have likes, check marks, purchases, you clear out your inbox, or everything's like quick and tidy and just with a nice bow on it, right? But our deeper needs are open ended, and they're not so linearly check marked off, right? And they require more of us in every way. So I think that is something to notice, is like, what is it that's making us feel good because it's just tied up in a nice bow, whether it's a cliche or an action or a moment.
Where you have this sense of resolve where you're like, oh, I've taken care of that now. Whether I've taken care of it mentally, emotionally, physically, it's off my radar. I don't have to store it in my brain and use my thought and energy to continue to analyze it and contemplate on it. It's just out of sight, out of mind. So you're saying that these moments of resolve, these really clean, tight, close-ended processes, whatever it is we're evaluating in our lives, making decisions around, these are the places to look. Where have we skipped something to get to an end, and in doing so missed part of the processing, really important data? Or have we closed it off where we're no longer able to come back to it for reevaluation? Like, this is the way I do it now.
Yeah. And also another thing to look for is what is a proxy that is visible to others. So like invisible to ourselves, that kind of allows us to think one thing, but that also allows us to avoid vulnerability. So like the dating app situation, or in our interactions where we're texting instead of calling each other or meeting each other. That is a proxy texting where we don't have to be as vulnerable, we don't have to be as accountable, and there's less risk. That's all a terrible substitution when there's a really important conversation that needs to be had, where you need to hear the human voice or you need to show up in person, and instead we use texting. That is a very common bad substitution.
This leads me into an evaluation of how digital technology is interfacing with substitutions. Because, for instance, an over reliance on Google Maps to show you the way, to substitute you learning the way. And then if you have an outage or you lose your phone or something, like to be caught in a moment where you don't know how to get to an important place, work, home, school, or even for kids that are relying on certain tools and not learning the practices of how to notice where the sun is in the afternoon and walk that direction. These are always the kind of human processing skills that we talk about in human decision intelligence. So the question here is, in what ways is our digital environment providing substitutions that prevent us from acquiring those skills?
It's access to products. For example, self-care products, like, oh, you're offered digitally a product that can help you feel better, and so you purchase that item quickly. But then there's a bypassing of emotional regulation that takes practice and vulnerability that you can't substitute with a bath or shower ritual, even though those are good, and that is a part of our regulation, right? Is creating rituals. And we talked about this in another episode, where we have a conscious engagement with the physical rituals that do indeed help us create and develop self-regulation, but not if that's the only thing we're doing, right? If we're, again, substituting, we're using a product to substitute actual practice and skill.
Like when you're in a conflict in a moment with your boss and you're like, hold the phone, I need to grab my calm app so I can do a breathing meditation. Some of these tools are great to develop the kind of emotional regulation that you can use without the product being present. So that if you're in a moment of conflict with your boss, you know how to breathe in a way that can regulate your nervous system so that you've built that skill to engage the conflict.
We work with all kinds of anxiety and how anxieties surface. And one of the most introductory things is just noticing when one has anxiety. How does that show up in individual people? And then what do you do? And so, yeah, the knowledge of it is great. The knowledge of what actually is happening chemically in the body and neurologically and all that is really great. But outside of your own experience of when it's happening, that isn't helpful if you can't activate that knowledge, for yourself. There's skipping.
In a moment, how can we notice, oh my gosh, I'm really feeling alone. And so that's why I just texted that friend that I always get, in a fight with or end up feeling worse at the end of, and now we're going out to grab a cocktail. So it is this noticing that I think we should draw people's attention to. It's this presence to understand, how do we get to the root, the source of what we're trying to substitute? And from there, be able to make better choices.
Yeah. I mean, the first thing that we can do is to take time to pause, to wait, and to be patient. And in that time, then it's about asking questions and kind of building in some self-reflection to where we can get to our needs or our desires and we can name them. And so that we're not in a reaction, in a stress response, right? Because that's how substitutions often show up, is out of a stress response or a need or desire. How do we get in touch with those needs and desires and stresses and name them, and then build in time to have some reflection around it? What are our options once we're in a stress response? And how do I want to meet my needs and desires? What are my options? How could that occur differently versus bypassing, versus having a quick fix that really leaves us oftentimes more empty, even though it is nice at times to go have fun, go dance. That's really healthy, right? We're not saying that's not healthy. It's really healthy to go out and dance and have fun or go to a party, but without recognizing the internal void or the drive to go do that can be different. What makes me feel better sometimes is an over self-expression. or an overthinking. It's kind of a meaning instead of being situation, right? Where
Mm-hmm.
if I have a new idea or a new insight, that can make me feel better because I found something that's important and meaningful that I can integrate, even though it's not really being integrated. And so that's the next step. And sure, it can feel productive, but let's not stop there. Let's not keep reading, or let's take some time to actually metabolize and integrate our knowledge or our insights or the meaning that we found.
So I heard you talking about noticing it. It reminded me of like noticing our patterns. So that might be a starting place for people. Like when this happens, I always do this. So like when I'm stressed or when I'm lonely, I make this decision. And then I like to think about option C. So it's really easy to have binary thinking, meaning I go to the party or I don't go to the party. But introducing an option C is like, what if I went early or went with this friend or went to that party instead, or invited someone over? Introducing another way to come to a decision that isn't in our typical binary ways of being, which is yes and no. And then being able to put all of your needs and desires out on the table. Like, I don't want to be alone. I want to be out. I want to see this friend. I don't want to be around for that phone call, whatever those things are, and then kind of stacking them in priority. So, like, oh, the most important thing for me to do is this. And then this need actually comes as a lesser thing to that desire.
Yeah, I think structuring how to be less habituated in our substitutions. And that's the key. It's not one offs. These are not like occasional things. Like these substitutions are habitual that we're speaking to. And the concept and topics of substitutions are rooted in habit, how we consistently go to a substitution instead of something more real. It is starting with what is this pattern and this habit trying to give me? And also, what is it hiding? So, where am I hiding? Inside the substitution, what am I hiding? Vulnerability, a certain kind of friction or disruption, the things that we've listed out already. Those are the things that we're avoiding. So a lot of the substitutions happen because of avoidance. And here's the thing, the more intelligent we become, the more intelligent our substitutions become as well. And so when our substitutions evolve, they become a little bit more difficult to notice. And so this becomes this question, what am I avoiding? And how does this habit and this pattern help me avoid the more difficult, challenging elements of our existence and our relationships, and who I need to become, how I need to change?
I'm so glad we went there because I was like going to take it for the jugular next, because the substitution of some kind of fantasy or delusion for reality is this exact avoidance. So this is for the people who are already like, I'm healthy, I'm not hiding from anything, I leave things open-ended, I call you right, like who have some kind of discipline, are prioritizing a lot of their needs, are really integrated, really present to themselves. And yet there could still be work to do to uncover the less conscious places that we substitute, deep places that we don't want to face in our being or our existence, the deepest, truest reality. And so this question is really interesting for me to look at, where are we avoiding things we might not be so aware of, and how the substitutions can actually look really healthy and positive. And this is exactly where our conversation on logic, and it's like, these are the places where we hide and can't be caught. We can't even catch ourselves.
I think it is a question of, what am I avoiding? If I'm texting because I want to avoid a confrontation, or I want to avoid accountability instead of calling or meeting up in person, because in person we're held accountable in a different way. We can't leave the room as easily. We have to be more vulnerable. More is required of us. And that is actually correct, the way that it should be in our relationships, and especially our intimate ones. And I'm not saying that they're not places for text and emails instead of calls or in person. I'm not saying that. The question is, how often are we substituting in effort to avoid accountability and vulnerability?
Yeah. And it's in those moments where there's the higher risk of potential accountability that we both practice those skills, sharpen those skills. And if we don't have them, we become really aware of the need for those skills to engage conflict, to work through things in relationship, to be held accountable, and as a result, to grow into someone different instead of staying where we are and not acquiring those skills. If someone took one thing away from this conversation related to substitutions, what would that thing be?
It's the question mark of how are you and we engaging in a substitution that leaves us more empty, more alone, and with less intimacy in our lives? And the question mark there is, what need and desire are we unconsciously trying to meet with a substitution? And not only are we not meeting it, but it's leaving us more and more empty. The invitation to ask ourselves the question is, what kind of rule or what kind of belief or what kind of structure are we creating so that we can hide and be comfortable and justify a lack of vulnerability, a lack of risk, and all of the bypassing that is required to actually grow? And not just grow as individuals, but to grow in our relationships, which requires us to learn intimacy and skills and capacity. So that's the biggest question. And that's difficult to find because it's a blind spot. And this is a deep cultural, social blind spot. Like, the depth of our substitutions are vast. And some of them are really easy to spot, which we've spotted. Corporate in structures are easier to spot. Some of the digital things are easier to spot. Now, our relational things, that's when we get really tricky, is how do we uncover some of our substitutions relationally when they're in our deepest needs and desires?
What do we lose when we make a substitution? It's that we lose the opportunity to integrate the real thing into who we are, becoming a person who has the lifestyle, the discipline, the knowledge, and then really where it lands, and this is why I'm bringing it up, is the skills, capacity, and desire to do or have the real thing.
Yeah. The skills, capacity, and desire to do and have the real thing. And there's no real shortcuts in becoming. And there's no shortcuts in developing our relational capacity and skill. And those are all decisions we make. So just to tie this back to human decision intelligence, is that if we cannot recognize the substitutions, we're not able to make clear decisions, or the decisions that we're making will be based off of substitutions that will cloud our goals and that will also cloud our process. And that's what human decision intelligence is focused on, is how do we increase the quality of our processing of the information, all these layers and domains of information, so that we can get to a better outcome. And if we're not recognizing how we individually, culturally, socially, corporately are creating these substitutions that are increasing the deficits that we have, and if we're not at minimum being honest with those deficits, we have a lot more obstacles than we think we have. And that's the point of decision intelligence, is let's look at things honestly and more comprehensively in order to navigate all of the things, which are just a stream of different decisions.
Yeah, it's like having decision debt when you're using substitutions. And so a lot of times when we start working with people, one of the first things that we do in this kind of process of untangling, if someone has some kind of decision to make or some anxieties around it, or they're ending up in some kind of discomfort, some of the untangling is noticing what are the root sources and root causes, and then where have substitutions taken us down the wrong roads? And how can we evaluate what's underneath those substitutions? What are the greatest needs and desires? And then reprioritize the truest needs and desires and make decisions from those places so that we end up where we want to go, instead of ending up in this kind of masked and disguised decision making, because we're making decisions from a place of quick fixes without evaluating the root cause of our symptoms.
What we're talking about here is the habitual kind of compulsiveness of our substitutions. It spans from our food choices all the way to our, career choices and our relationship choices. It's the exact same mechanism that is happening across all these domains. And that's why we're bringing it up. The place that I have practiced probably all of these concepts and insights is in the place of patience, in the place of pausing, in the place of waiting, and in the place of lingering. That there is a liminality, whether it's short or long, that helps humans discern and to feel out what is more true and what is more real in this moment for themselves. So before making any decision and before action, which requires a decision, it's to be patient, to pause, to wait, and to allow the truth or an experience or knowledge to emerge. But we have to give that time and space. And that is the overall encouragement. And the more that I have done that personally, the more accurate I've become, the more precise that I have been able to see things. But it doesn't happen immediately. It requires space and time and reflection, attention. And so that, if anything, is one of the most important practices in decision making.
I'm looking forward to getting into the conversation around speed versus efficiency, because everything you just noted around taking time, to the average listener is like, no, I don't have time. We want to go quickly. But then as you note the accuracy and precision, it's the slowness that creates an ultimate efficiency.
Yeah. And that waiting is good, that there can be joy in this spaciousness. And we are conditioned culturally that that's somehow painful. And I definitely struggle with patience. This has been my lifelong practice, and I have seen waiting as absolute suffering. And I think I'm just now getting to the point where there can be joy in waiting. There can be joy in patience, or at minimum, there's a neutrality to it because there's something deeply good that is necessary in taking a beat and pausing. And so that is one area that we can potentially reframe, is that it is good and most often better when we wait and give space, particularly in a culture of speed.